Thank you for joining XROM, which is India's first AR/VR focused podcast. Today, I'm honored to have with me Mr. Daniel Sisson, who's a VR developer, tech marketeer, writer, and an entrepreneur who likes to imagine a better future. He has a newsletter titled Now and 10 and runs a software company titled Cyberhub Syndicate and is on a mission to make the open metaverse a reality. So, Daniel, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast.
Of course.
We start with small, brief introduction and background.
Sure. Yeah, happy to be here. So, just to give you guys a quick introduction, my name is Daniel, of course. I've been in the technology industry for almost all of my career. I spent about 10 years in San Francisco working in kind of the more traditional technology industry. So, B2B enterprise software startups. Some of them were bootstrapped, some of them were venture-backed. And for me, I ended up kind of getting into this whole VR world in a moment in time. I've always been a self-taught developer and was always curious about VR. I had some of the earlier VR headsets, but then when the Quest 2, which I actually have right over here, when the Quest 2 came out, I bought it, and I don't know what caused me to do it, but I decided to download Unity and start following some tutorials on the internet and really figure out how to build something. And I actually built this really, really horrible bowling game, and it was really bad. You could throw the ball at the pins, and then that was it. If you missed the pins, you had to just exit the app and restart the app. The ball didn't come back to you or anything like that. But just having built that and putting it into my headset and then being inside the thing that I created, it was just such a magical moment for me that I realized in that moment that the traditional technology industry that I had been a part of for so long just didn't matter to me anymore. There was something so special about experiencing what you're building in 3D and being inside of it. I had been making websites since as long as I can remember, but you're never inside your website. You're always, staring at a screen. And now in virtual reality, I could be inside what I created. And so that was kind of this moment where I just began to push my entire career into the virtual reality space and culminating in starting this startup. And part of the reason that I saw the need for this startup is that it is so complicated to build your own kind of complex multiplayer games and experiences. And so the team and I started this startup particularly to enable developers to more easily build complex multiplayer VR games and apps.
Lovely. How cool is that? And I like the part that, we got into this world where, you don't necessarily need to have a traditional education background to build things because I think the internet has kind of democratized knowledge and has given it access to anyone and everyone. You could be sitting in any part of the world. So I take this from you, and I think the listeners should also take this interesting thing that today, if you want to start, that there's no age and there's no barrier that you need to go.
Not.
You can just get online, and there's a bunch of tutorials, and you
1,000%.
Yes.
I'll do you even a little bit better there. So I don't have a computer science degree. That's number one, and then number two is the first developer that I actually hired. Not only does he not have a computer science degree, I hired him right out of high school. He taught himself on the internet, watching YouTube videos and Googling things and learning how to do VR development with Unity. And he was so good, he built a really nice portfolio of work. And then he was also just such a nice boy. So he had a good attitude. He already had a portfolio of work, and he was hustling and putting himself out there. And so he was a contractor for us. And then he was so amazing, I hired him as an employee, and he never went to college. And
Lovely.
just went straight to working for us.
I dropped out of college, and I've got no background in tech whatsoever. I've largely been in the creative industry, and then I got into, I run a startup. I'm building metaverses, and I do two podcasts. And I don't know anything about tech whatsoever. So I do one podcast, which is, what AR, VR, MR in the metaverse. And there's another podcast, which is about deep tech and future tech, and where I go to, quantum computing, AGI, genetic editing, and so on and so forth. It's just my desire to learn, I guess. So I think, what you need is an intent and a desire. And I think, that's the core, and everything else kind of falls in place. Now, you said that your first love was, when you bought the Oculus headset 2, and when you realized that, you could break away from the 2D world and start building in, 3D worlds, which is similar to ours. I mean, that's what grabbed your attention. And the virtual reality, yes, obviously, but the virtual reality, the name itself is kind of now, we giving it this different names. We're calling it the metaverse. So what are your views on the metaverse, and what do you think is the metaverse, and how is it going to impact society?
First and foremost, I don't think that the metaverse is here yet. I think it's something that we're building towards. Right now, we do have virtual reality. We do have 3D worlds. We do have very similar things that I would even say are very similar to what the metaverse will be. But when people think about the metaverse, and particularly technologists, science fiction authors, futurists, when we're thinking about the metaverse, we're thinking about a much more comprehensive, robust 3D environment that changes society. And that's not quite here yet. What is here right now is the internet. And so the internet is already doing a lot of what we think in our minds the metaverse will do. And in fact, like right here, right now, I'm in California. You are absolutely not in California. And across 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 miles, we're able to easily talk to each other, no problem, with I don't know, 2 milliseconds of latency. And it basically, it's like I'm staring through a window on my computer monitor and I can talk to you across the world. And this is a large part of what we thought the metaverse was going to do when we were originally writing books about it in the science fiction. So Neil Stephenson wrote Snow Crash, and a significant part of the book of where even the word metaverse came from was that Japanese businessmen and American businessmen were doing business together in a 3D virtual environment. And we almost have that now today, but it hasn't changed society. And this is where I think that over the next couple of years to next 10 years, you're going to start to see the 3D spatial internet really start to affect society a lot more. And the biggest thing would be that it would be the headsets themselves would be less heavy. So if you look at like the Quest 2 is right behind me over here, or if you've ever played with the Quest 2 headset, it's big, it's a little bit heavy. There's a lot of friction to putting it on. I think when we get to the point where they're as simple or as lightweight as the glasses that you have on your face, it really changes things, and people will start to have this 3D internet on their face almost at all points in time. And so that itself will begin to really shape things.
Right. Yeah. So I think, you rightfully pointed out, the internet has been something which has kind of really changed the world, and changed the society and how we live, work, play, communicate. And communication itself is such a fantastic tool. But this communication itself has been, we still behind a 2D interface. And I think the virtual reality, AR, MR, metaverse, when it finally falls in place, it will break this barrier of 2D, and maybe in possibly like a couple of years, with my hologram, I could be sitting next to you, you could be sitting next to me, and we could have these conversations like we be sitting next to each other, and possibly with haptic feedback, we could touch, feel the virtual world. So exciting space that we're getting into. You run a startup called Cyberhub Syndicate, which is building VR developer tools. Would you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So we started Cyberhub Syndicate as kind of the umbrella corporation, and we have a couple of different projects underneath that. So Cyberhub Syndicate is kind of like Alphabet is to Google. So it's the corporate entity that owns everything. Underneath that, we have a few things. One is Spatial Ape. It's a VR developer community group that meets up in virtual reality. So we don't do Zoom meetings. We don't do, we don't talk on the internet. We actually meet up in virtual reality, a group of developers regularly to talk about our projects. And we do that in a custom app that we've built. The other main project, and actually the main product that we sell, is called Foundry. And Foundry is a developer tool made by us that makes it easier for developers to build custom complex multiplayer software. How do we do that? If you want to go build a multiplayer virtual reality game, that's going to be like a hit on the Quest store, there's a huge gap between what Unity gives you and where you need to actually start. And so what we do is we build that gap. And what is that gap? That gap is pre-configured multiplayer, the avatars being configured correctly. It's optimization for virtual reality, and it's also a library of objects that we call prefabs, a library of preset objects that are easy to interact with. So as an example for the business side, whiteboards. Almost everybody loves whiteboards in virtual reality, but you got to go build it. And so we've already built the virtual reality whiteboard, and we have it pre-configured, pre-packaged into Foundry. And so we sell this to businesses so that it makes it a lot faster and easier for them to build their own enterprise metaverse world for business collaboration or virtual reality training. And so they only need to focus on the specifics of their environment, any specific mechanics that they want to build, but the foundation, the baseline is already pre-built.
Now, multiplayer OS, there are a couple of other players who are actually working on building an OS for that. One is Improbable, Hadian is working on that, RP1 is working on that. When you're saying you're building a multiplayer OS, what's the how many concurrent users can be online at the same time through Foundry, and how does it
Sure.
work?
So at the moment, right now, with version 1 of Foundry, we're using another company's multiplayer tool called Photon. And so Photon is a multiplayer networking company, and they've built out different tools, one of which is Photon Fusion. And with Photon Fusion, theoretically, you can have up to 200 people in the same environment with no problems. We haven't even managed to test 200 people yet, but I have a sneaking suspicion that already at 200 people, we're going to have a little bit of problems, and we're going to have to do some customization to make that actually work correctly. So what we're building towards right now is to have about 75 people in one environment with no problems, and then have up to 200 people with potentially not problems, but what we would do is you would simplify the avatars, for example. So rather than having, so if you want to have 100 people or 150 or 200 people, there's a lot of processing happening. So it makes it simpler if you drop down to just like heads and hands, for example, in the avatars, instead of having a full body. And over time, over the next 6, 12, 18 months, we're going to build out a multiplayer solution from scratch to enable us to more easily do hundreds and hundreds of people, if not potentially thousands of people in virtual reality concurrently.
Lovely. How cool is that? Then we'll truly have these multiplayer experiences where the entire world will be populated rather than, the worlds that we have, where it's basically pretty much empty at this point of time. What's the pricing points at this point of time, and who are your competitors, besides the names that I gave you at this point of time?
Sure. So right now, like when we have two different pricing models. We have free, which sounds crazy, but I'll explain that in just a second. And then we have the enterprise product, which we're charging $25,000 per year. And so on the free side, it's actually not only free, but it's open source. And so the baseline version of the product is free and open source. And then and we give that away obviously free. And the goal there is to enable as many virtual reality developers as possible to build their own multiplayer games, apps, experiences, and worlds. And then on the enterprise product, the enterprise product is inclusive of the open source version. It's built on top of that. It's an additional set of features, security, and control that allow the enterprises to have their business metaverse environment as well as complete security and control. And that we charge $25,000 a year for the baseline license.
Right. When do you think the metaverse is going to become a reality? What will make it a reality? And in your profile, it says you're on a mission to make the open metaverse a reality. Can you elaborate on that?
When do I think the metaverse is going to be a reality? It's a few years from now, but I think it's going to be a steady progression. So even in the next 12 months, there's a rumor that Apple's going to be putting a headset out. I think when Apple puts a headset out, it helps solidify this market. Right now, Facebook, Meta, has put out the Quest 2 headset. Great. And it has helped a lot. There are millions of new virtual reality users with headsets that actively use it per month. And just in a recent Wall Street Journal article, it cited 6 million monthly active users. That's not a lot compared if you compare that to obviously mobile phones, or you compare that to computers and something like that. There's billions of people on mobile and computers, but 6 million is not a small amount of people using one specific headset, monthly active. So I think as the hardware manufacturers produce really good headsets and better headsets, and particularly when we get to the point where there's glasses like you're wearing, that will massively increase adoption. That is probably going to be on a spectrum of 1 to 10 years. So every year from now through the next 10 years, it's going to get better and better and better and more and more. On the software side, there's people like us that are building the correct tooling to enable more developers to build more content. And so that will also help bring more developers into the ecosystem and bring more content. And if you think about like mobile apps, there was an explosion of mobile apps, and it became easier and easier and easier for developers to build mobile apps and build mobile games. And now you have so much content on mobile, or so much content on PC. Right now, it's still relatively hard to build virtual reality content. As far as the open component, that's where I come back to what we're building. So both the open source version, it's part of why we're not only giving away our baseline version for free, but we're open sourcing it, is because that we don't want the metaverse to become something exclusively controlled by Meta or Apple or Google or Microsoft. We want the metaverse to be as open and free as the internet is. And so we're trying to enable as many people to build what they want to build more easily. And so we're doing that with the developer community. And that's where the open source version of the product is. Even on the business enterprise version of the product, the way that we've structured how we distribute the software is that they're buying a license to the actual source code. And so what that means is that the enterprises are allowed to build their own custom business metaverse, and they don't have to deploy it on our platform. There's no platform that they have to deploy it on. They can freely deploy this to the internet, to the world, and run their own custom business metaverse. So that basically we're doing this so that we're enabling developers and businesses and people to not be completely dependent at all on any of these other platforms. And most of the competitors you've recommended, or if you were to look at others, like people that are building for Horizon or VR Chat or Engage or Arthur, there's a lot of platforms out there. All of them are trying to attract developers and users to their platform and trap them inside their platform. This to me is not how the internet works. It's just not how the internet works at all. I want it to be open and able for everybody to build whatever they want and deploy whatever they want to the world without being trapped inside of a platform at all. So I'm opening up our software both on the open source side as well as on the business side by giving away the source code as part of the licensing.
Lovely. How cool is that? I think more and more entrepreneurs are looking at building things where it's more inclusive and more open. Now, you mentioned about the flaws of the Web2 industry. And in your profile, you talk about interoperability. Now, most of the way the businesses work today is in a capitalistic, top-down, hierarchical manner, and you wouldn't want your user to go to another platform. So how do you think interoperability is going to pan out and going to affect these big players in the long run?
Yeah. So the only way that interoperability is almost the hardest part of all this. And right now, we're barely even working towards that at all realistically. Right now, today in April of 2023, as we're having this conversation, our first step is just by being more open as opposed to being a closed platform or a closed ecosystem. That's step one. Step two is the deployment method. And so if you think about how a web app is completely interoperable to all computers and phones able to access the internet, right? The internet itself is the most interoperable network system that we've created globally. It's the internet itself is probably the single best thing that we humans have invented so far. It's probably the single best thing because it aggregates and collects all human knowledge and connects all of us in a completely open way, which is amazing. No one company or government controls or owns the internet, and that's amazing. And so I believe that in the long run, and we're working towards this, that the metaverse itself will need to be just as open as the internet is today, and it will probably actually be built off of the internet and just be a 3D spatial version of the internet. And so to that end, we're very, very early, but we're exploring web XR and deployment to the internet and thinking about how to do things on the internet. It's super early right now. Nothing we have in production or even in early development. It's kind of more in the research stage. But I have a suspicion that over the next few years, this will be the play. And most of us that are in this space are going to move towards a more mature and together build a more mature web XR or spatial 3D internet.
What's your view on India's XR market? Because we are growingly becoming a software hub, and there are loads of developers. When it comes to XR, metaverse, blockchain, AI, and so on and so forth. You mentioned about Spatial Ape, which is a VR developers community group. Are there any Indian VR developers in the group? Are you looking at this side because the dollar size is much cheaper over here?
Yeah. So the thing about India is that's really interesting to me. I mean, I spent over 10 years of my career in Silicon Valley, and as you may know, there's now kind of a revolving door between Silicon Valley and India. And so a number of entrepreneurs from India will end up in San Francisco, San Jose, Fremont, Newark, et cetera, and living in the Bay Area. And then they go back to India and vice versa. And so what's kind of beautiful, I think, about Silicon Valley and about India's technology industry is that you start to have a kind of interchange between them. In fact, one of the first technology companies I worked for in the Bay Area was an Indian company, and there were only a few of us in the United States. I was actually one of the few Americans working for the company, and in fact, most of the people were in New Delhi, in an office in New Delhi, and the team was all there. There were a handful of us in the United States, and then the CEO himself was an Indian guy, and he was in the US with me. But it was just him and I in San Francisco, and everybody else was in India, and then a few people throughout the United States. And so when it comes to XR, I think you're starting to see the same thing. So you're seeing that a lot of the Indian community lives in the United States, goes back to India, and some of them are in the XR space, and they're going back and forth. And the Indians that are here in the United States in the XR industry form a bridge back to India. And so you're starting to see India itself begin to develop startup companies. And India itself, and originally it was in cloud and outsourcing, but no longer. No one even thinks about India as an outsourcing country anymore. India is now developing its own startups, which are strong in their own right. As well as India's economy beginning to develop further. For me, I think when I was in college, which is a long time ago now, but when I was in college, they said, look out for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And now, when you think about it, Brazil and Russia are off the table. It's really, as we look to the future, it's going to be, I think, the Western world as a whole, and then you're going to have India and China, and these are really the entities to look out for. Look out for India, China, and the collective Western world.
You write a blog, a newsletter called Now and 10. Would you want to talk about it?
Sure. So you talked a little bit about your two podcasts and how one of your podcasts is a little bit more about future technologies, AGI, and things like that. So in my blog Now and 10, I've kind of combined these both. I talk a lot about virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality, because it's the industry I'm in. But I also talk a lot about the future technology trends. And so I call it Now and 10 because it's the things happening in the technology industry now and the things that are happening that are going to affect us over the course of the next 10 years. And those things that are going to affect us over the course of the next 10 years are exactly what you just described. Artificial general intelligence, crypto, though I still think crypto is very early. Remote work as a trend also. So separate from technology, the concept of remote and globalization and even this whole digital nomad thing that you're beginning to see, I think is going to have a massive effect on the world that most people are not paying enough attention to. And then some of the things that are a little more fun and interesting that I care about are space and space exploration. It's very exciting what SpaceX and Blue Origin and these companies are doing. It's very exciting. The United States is now putting a little more money to go back to the moon. India and China are investing in their space programs. And so I think that over the course of our lifetimes, I'm not that old, you're not that old. I think that over the course of our lifetimes, space is going to become a very interesting new thing. And at some point, I have a sneaking suspicion that you and I will make it to the moon before we die. We will be able to go on a trip to the moon and actually spend some time. Maybe it's in a hotel for fun or something like that. But I have a sneaking suspicion we'll be able to go to the moon on a vacation before we die.
Cheers to that, Daniel. So my last question, what's your roadmap for your startup? And since you write this blog newsletter, which is called Now and 10, paint a picture of what the world is going to look like in the next 10 years.
Okay, so the first one, real quick, just for the roadmap for the startup, it's really hard to think about the next 10 years for the startup. When I think about the next 10 years for the startup in particular, the market we're playing in is the collective XR market. So virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, 3D spatial environments, the metaverse, et cetera. And so ultimately, we're hoping to build the company into a very strong, successful software company in and around metaverse and 3D simulation for developers. So there's an opportunity here, I believe, to build this piece by piece. Right now, the current software that we're building easily could become a hundreds of millions of dollars worth of startup. The general industry itself will generate over the course of 10 years numerous billion-dollar companies. Could we become a billion-dollar company? I think so. I think there's a chance. There's a higher probability that somebody will probably buy us along the way. Maybe Unity or somebody like that will say, you guys are awesome. We're just going to acquire you, and maybe I'll sell the startup. When it comes to the rest of society, I think that the kind of more interesting trends over the course of the next 10 years is AGI, and maybe even if we don't even get to AGI, I think just even what we're seeing now with the language learning models and with the machine learning and with the more narrow forms of artificial intelligence, I think this is going to have an impact on people and on society and work just so much more than most kind of normal people are thinking about. You think about it, I think about it. Most normal people don't really think about it. I think that the common refrain is technology has always enabled new types of jobs. And I believe that up to a point. I think that there's a point in time where the AI can also do those new jobs. And then the AI will do the other new jobs that the AI itself creates. And then you get to a point where, what's left for us humans? And I think that this could either be the worst possible thing that happens to humanity, or this could potentially be the best possible thing that happens to humanity. And I don't know if there's much in between. I think we will collectively decide that we're going to figure out how to make the robots work for us, and we all actually get what we've always wanted as a collective society, is for the robots to do work and we all work less. Or conversely, a very small group of the population globally owns all the robots, and we're all kind of screwed, which I think is a very horrible situation that I have a sneaking suspicion that even if we went to there, that couldn't possibly last long without revolutions. People themselves are not going to just stand by and die, right? So needless to say, I think the next 10 years are going to be very, very interesting, because you have interrelated as well as completely unrelated technology trends that are affecting people dramatically. One being artificial intelligence, another being crypto, another being space exploration. I think the next 10 years are going to be very, very, very exciting when it comes to space exploration. We may see a fervor or an excitement like there was in the 1960s when we first put a human being on the moon. caused a lot of young people to become very excited about space. And you saw kind of an enormous boom in space exploration. I think in this next era, we're going to start to see an enormous excitement around space as we not only put human beings back on the moon, but we begin to put human beings into orbit, human beings onto Mars, and really start to explore our solar system, which is really exciting. So separate from the whole robot overtaking the world situation, exploring the solar system is also very exciting. And I think that that's a big one. But I'll leave you with one thing that I think is a little bit more from a society standpoint that I think a lot of people are not really thinking about, which is artificial intelligence, the metaverse, 3D connectedness, the fact that you and I are easily having this conversation across a very large geographic distance, and crypto and all these things, remote work. The pandemic happened and a lot of us started working from home. I'm now in my home office. I used to work in an office downtown in San Francisco. Now I work in my house. I actually left San Francisco. I now live in sunny San Diego, and I'm thinking about moving to Barcelona, Spain, because Barcelona is even better than San Diego. So why not? And that, I think, is the beginning of another major trend that is going to dramatically affect the world. As you see, it'll start with Americans and Brits from London and whatnot, but it'll trickle down to the rest of the masses. You have a middle class and an upper middle class in major cities in India right now that often end up going to the UK or going to the United States of America. But what happens when those Indians begin to say, hey, wait a sec, like, we don't actually have to go to the Bay Area. We don't actually have to go to London. We can go to the Caribbean, or we can go to Spain, or we can go to the Canary Islands, or we can go to Africa, or we can go somewhere that is beautiful, that is different, that is a little bit less expensive, or that is interesting. And they begin to form these pockets all around the world in different parts of the world. And you have this mixing of Americans and Europeans and Indians and Latin Americans, et cetera, all over the world, forming entrepreneurial communities and internet first communities all over the world. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but it's going to make the national lines very blurry. What happens when Americans live all over the world? What happens when Indians already live all over the world, but now they live in more parts of the world? And what happens when the Brits live not just in the UK and Spain, which they live now, but what happens when the Brits live in the UK and Spain and parts of the Caribbean and parts of Northern Africa and parts of Eastern Europe, like Croatia, or like the Mediterranean parts of Eastern Europe, like Croatia and places like that? It's going to start to really dramatically change things.
Daniel, really appreciate you taking time being part of the podcast. Wish you and the team the very best. Yes, there are not many players in the multiplayer OS space, and yes, it could be that your company could be that $1 billion startup, or possibly you could get acquired. So wish you the very best for it. And yes, technology, I think, has come to a point where it's scary as well as exciting. Scary because we have been running a world in a capitalist structure where the greed is really up there, and it's that small number of people which is maximizing everything, and the rest of the people are just left out from the game. But today, I think we've got the opportunity to democratize things through technology, and there's some exciting things happening. You mentioned about reverse migration, and I've been living in Bombay City for 50 years, and I've moved out. I've got a remote work. My team is distributed all around the world. And I think more and more people will see that these cities are dying because more and more people are coming in. You have the opportunity to move out to greener pastures, and where you can work, where you enjoy, spend family time and connect. And rightfully, I think the world has been so divided with boundaries. Eventually, I think, maybe that those lines will get blurred, and maybe, we'll be going everywhere, and everyone will be just working towards making sure that the world gets better, because so far it's always been personal greed, over everything else. I think the future is a collective space, because the way AI is growing, I think everybody needs to be in a collective mode and work towards a better future. So really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Super.